Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Teach MA Dude, where I'm going to go over some real concepts from a real Massachusetts teacher's perspective that a lot of folks face on an everyday basis. This is going to be a controversial one, folks. We're going to be talking about the MCAS. That's right, the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, which is the standardized test that folks are going to take throughout their educational journey. And then it culminates with the 10th grade English and math exams. The Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, or MCAS, has really been a key piece to the No Child Left Behind law that was passed in the early 2000s during the Bush administration. And the idea was that it was important to ensure accountability, that schools were, doing what they needed to do to educate the children and that they were making effective progress, that, there needed to be regular data gathered. And the way you would do that is via a standardized test. Now, these are called standardized because they're given in the same way to each group of students who takes them. There are some students who do get extra time, for example, but the script that is read, the process that is gone through to take the test, as many educators know, is painstakingly consistent. And that's important to kind of try to get the most valid results that you can. All right. So, it is given throughout the elementary years. As a child growing up in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I took the MCAS, I believe, in 3rd through 8th grade. I'm pretty sure I remember taking them every year, but I might not have. I went in middle school and high school was during like the first decade of the 20th century, so like 2000 to 2007. But I was kind of one of the first groups where it was going to be that it was taken in order to graduate from high school. Now, this was a requirement that was put in beginning in the classes of the early 2000s. And the idea was to put a little bit more muscle behind the MCAS to ensure that not only were the results being given, but that they were good enough to demonstrate the kid was ready for post-high school life. The thing is, you can give tests every year and collect data. That's a way that you know whether a school is performing well, and it's used to compare schools across the state. However, if there's no actual impetus for doing well, then what's it matter if the student's not getting acceptable grades? And also, how do we know if a student's ready for high school and college life or career life? And how do we evaluate and determine like what skills they still might need to dig a little bit deeper into? So it is now the case that when you're in high school, you need to pass. And that doesn't mean you have to ace it. You have to get a not like a failing grade. And right now, like not meeting expectations is, I believe, the current like failing grade. When I was a kid, it was first failing and then warning. And so you had to get like a needs improvement or better. So now you have to get what's called a partially meeting expectations. At least you can get meeting or exceeding expectations on the MCAS. And you have to do this in 3 different kind of like branches. So you have to pass the science, technology, engineering. And that's usually done with biology or chemistry or physics, depending on what students usually take in 9th grade. And there's a specific 10th grade English and 10th grade math. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they are offered in the elementary and middle grades all the way through 8th grade. Those are not, there's no requirement, they just kind of measure your ability at the end of the year. And we'll get to what that means later, but they're going to measure your ability at the end of the year. And then that's kind of it. You're going to move on, and it doesn't really matter. The MCAS doesn't really control that. And it doesn't really control that in high school either, but it doesn't really it's not going to prevent a kid from graduating to the next school or the next level of their educational journey in the elementary or the middle grades. All right, now, if you can get at least a passing grade on those 3 branches of the high school MCAS, so the science, technology, engineering, the English, and the math, then you are allowed to get a high school diploma. If you do not do so, then you will be getting what's called a certificate of attendance. That does not guarantee you admission to any college or university necessarily, depending on your individual circumstances. And though now, to their state's credit, you can do what's called a high school equivalency test or a high set, and you get what like a GED, and they now will let you do that for free a couple times, which is cool. So that is one point of controversy, in my opinion. I do think it's necessary to actually give some like punch to it, right? If you're not ensuring that kids are demonstrating the level of skills they need to have, then how are you going to just say, all right, we're going to collect data, we're good? And you also, there's a belief that we want to set high standards for our kids, because if we set the standards high, they'll rise to our high standards. And so I think it is good to set the standards high so they rise to the standards. So it's kind of like a background of where we are with the MCAS and why does the MCAS exist? So what are my thoughts on it? Do we need the MCAS? Are we ever going to get rid of the MCAS? Because that actually is a big push that the unions in Massachusetts are doing. In my opinion, we should not abandon the MCAS as a general principle. I think that, look, we all are in, moments where we're constantly growing and we're constantly trying to improve. We want the kids to improve, and we assess them with data to determine whether they are moving in a positive direction and meeting their full potential. The same needs to be applied to schools and to teachers and leaders. And that's okay, because as I said in some of my earlier videos, there's nothing wrong with not performing well. Everyone has room for improvement. And sometimes, the reality is that a lot of us, due to kind of systemic, inequalities, are not going to be necessarily starting from the same place. Those with resources will have, generally people who can spend more time working with them and supporting them outside of the school environment. And that creates differences in the support that students receive outside of school. And that's just something that, as educators, we don't really have any say in that, right? But it also is good to take a look at, and I have done this before, what kind of concepts are the students performing well at? What kind of concepts are they struggling with? And what can we kind of do about that? Now, unfortunately, starting with there are a couple of things that I think are worth noting. If we're constantly kind of, changing our instruction based on how well students are doing on the MCAS and where they're not doing as well, then it gets into a common criticism that teachers are teaching to the test. So what that means is that the teacher is teaching only what is going to be covered on the test and kind of maybe putting aside some of those important concepts. Now, this is important, I think, and I can see this kind of side to it, because the reality is that, when teachers are focusing on these set of skills, it's not necessarily the case those set of skills are what students need to value in real life. In my experience, I've seen kind of like, again, word problems that aren't really relevant to students. And I've seen big focuses on concepts such as, quadratics, I think maybe some stuff with area and volume, things like domain and range, which, while I think are important to have that kind of mental flexibility and to be able to answer those questions, many of them, in my opinion, are highly specialized. And it's not really clear how, if the student is not excelling at that skill, they're going to be set up for life after high school. Conversely, I've seen people that have cruised to the MCAS, but whom I struggled to teach relatively elementary math in college. So it's not an if or only if connection. Just because a student does well on the MCAS doesn't mean they're ready for college. And just because a student does poorly doesn't mean they're not. And a lot of that comes from the alignment of what skills are being covered versus what skills are necessary. In my experience, I've never been offered an opportunity to have a say in MCAS questions that are developed or to review previous MCAS questions. And I understand, right? You can't have teachers knowing what's on the test because, then it's going to put those students at an unfair advantage. What connection, I guess we could say, do the teachers have to, like, these people have to actual teaching, that is? So have these people been in a classroom recently, right? What kinds of things have they seen, right? And I get it, right? So the issue is Pearson could say, look, we have to, cater to what the standards are. We don't control the standards, but our job is to provide an assessment based on the standards that are emphasized or not emphasized by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Okay, that's not unfair. So basically, I think what it comes down to is this Common Core, which, while I think was very ambitious in the beginning, that's kind of something for a whole nother episode. But I think the issue is we now have to step back and say, look, Common Core push students to a high level, but is the skills they need to know really about college and career, with an emphasis on career? I think a student who performs very strongly on the MCAS will generally be ready to take on, some of the more at least basic, levels of math. But, in all honesty, I got a 280 out of 280 on the math when I took it in high school. And, math was a challenge for me as I approached college for other reasons that were kind of outside my control. So again, this idea that failing doesn't necessarily mean unready and not failing doesn't necessarily mean ready. Lastly, I just want to consider, I guess, and there's many things I could say, but I'll try to keep it short overall. So last thing I would get at is the idea of, we want to promote this idea of equity. We want to promote this idea that anyone has a fair chance to access what they need to be successful, but also to demonstrate their knowledge in a way that is flexible for them. So one thing that I think about is, in my personal experience, working with students with disabilities, right? We want to just remember that students with disabilities play an important role in society, and they have a lot to give back to society as adults. Perhaps they may not be able to go on to the traditional 4-year school right away, but we can't write off students with disabilities as a whole. We have to evaluate everyone fairly. There may be opportunities where we say, you know what, unfortunately, because of the independent skills, the mathematics skills or English skills or science skills, whatever skills they need to access at a minimum, they're just not there yet. And because of that disability, we weren't able to get to where we needed to get to. So we need to do some extra work right now. It's okay to say that. And I think the issue, though, is how can individuals show that they still have some important skills that they've developed in the time they've been in school? Right now in Massachusetts, we have what's called the MCAS alt, which is the MCAS alternative. Now, while that attempts to really dig down and get their understanding of math and et cetera, and whatever test they're going to take, but my issue is that it's, one, my understanding, extremely difficult to pass that. And even if you do, it does not count as actually passing the MCAS for purposes of graduation. Even if you're demonstrating that lower level of knowledge and you're being given a pass on this test, it still isn't getting you to where you ultimately need to be. That college diploma is out of the hands of the student unless, and this is where it comes to resources, the parents have the resources to send the kid to a private school, and private schools in Massachusetts are not covered by any of the MCAS requirements because they're not public schools. So if you're a student with disability, and you're in a private school, you're still able to get a high school diploma that in theory could get you into a college. So we also have to consider the equity impacts of that. There's a lot we could say about the MCAS at the end of the day, and it's unfortunate, but I know that the Massachusetts Teachers Association is very, not pro standardized testing. And while I understand that, this is just an issue that I simply don't agree. I would strongly advise educators, while I understand the importance of standing up for what you believe in, and, our vice president of the MTA, Deb McCarthy, was, I believe, known as someone who was what's called a conscientious objector, I believe it is, to taking the test, and, saying, really pushing back against being assigned to do it. I don't think that's a productive way to end standardized testing. And I don't think it's realistic to try to do so. If you want to change the regimes of that, it's something that has to be done on the federal level. But even if not, I would just be concerned about how do we work together as a community to move the needs of teachers forward if we're not, while we're also saying, but we don't expect you to be able to measure how we're doing. The reality is, and I don't want to put this in business terms, they need some kind of return on investment. And teachers honestly do a very good job. If you want to make the argument that the kids' home lives outside of school, things like that, things like systemic inequities, et cetera, put some students in a cycle of always doing poorly. I don't necessarily disagree with you. If you want to make an argument that we need to do more to actually understand how well schools are doing and students are doing, more than just putting this one test as a number on them, I agree with you on that too. I think there's many ways to evaluate a school, a student, a teacher that are not necessarily simply MCAS based. And again, there's a lot that goes into what it means for a student to be successful. There's going to be days in the year where they're going to perform a lot better. They've had food in their stomach, they're comfortable, they're feeling optimistic, they're feeling positive, and again, a lot of these things come down to stuff that we can't control, and really they can't control either. But again, I think it's important that we have a way to know how schools are doing, how students are doing, and we're able to put a number to it so that we're able to constantly think about how we can improve. But again, we want to do so in a way that kind of gets at these nuances that I've discussed in this video. So again, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you like this background, check out dallydrip.com, DALLEDRIP.com. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe to keep the algorithm fed and keep the word getting out there. I'd love to keep the conversation going with you. Thank you so much again. Have a wonderful night.